The autumn of 1886 came early to the Sierra Nevada Valley. By the first week of October, frost had already crept into the low places, stiffening the grass along the creek beds and leaving white edges on the fence rails that caught the morning light like something precious. The aspens had turned weeks ahead of schedule. Their leaves fell in silence, spinning down through cold air that carried the smell of granite and pine, and something else, something older. Something that had no name in English, but that certain people recognized the moment it reached their lungs. Most people in the valley did not notice. They were busy with the preparations that defined October in the mountains. Firewood to stack, livestock to move to lower pastures, root cellars to seal against the coming cold. The rhythms of survival that had been passed down from one generation to the next, each family, certain that what they knew was enough, that what their fathers had done would serve them as it had always served them before. They were not paying attention to the sky. One person was. Cornelius Hargrove rode past the construction site on the morning of October the 14th, his chestnut mare moving at an easy pace along the ridge road that overlooked the lower meadow. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with a gray-streaked beard and the particular confidence that comes from owning more land than anyone else within 20 miles. He had built his ranch from nothing over 30 years. He had survived two droughts, one early freeze that killed half his cattle, and a dispute over water rights that had lasted 7 years and cost him more in legal fees than the water was worth. He was not a man who surprised easily, but he pulled his mare to a stop that morning and stared. Down in the lower meadow, where the frost-killed grass met the first line of pine trees, something was rising from the earth that had no business being there. Logs stacked 2 stories high. A frame for a second floor, built so heavily it might have supported a small church. A hearth of granite blocks so massive that the men hauling them had to work in pairs, straining against ropes, their breath coming out in white clouds in the cold morning air. And directing all of it, not watching, not supervising from a distance, but actually directing hands, moving, pointing, measuring, climbing the half-built walls with the ease of someone who had done this before, was a woman. She was small, dark-haired, perhaps 30 years old. She wore a man's work coat and heavy boots, and she moved across the construction site with a purpose so absolute that the 2 hired men working alongside her matched their pace to hers without seeming to realize they were doing it. Hargrove watched for a full minute. Then he let out a laugh that rolled across the frost-hardened ground and echoed off the tree line. A widow building a lighthouse. He called out loud enough for the mill workers on the far side of the ridge to hear, "For a sea that doesn't exist." The woman stopped what she was doing. She looked up at him. The distance between them was perhaps 100 yards, but even from that distance, something in her gaze made Hargrove's laughter slow, then stop. Not anger, not embarrassment, not the flinching uncertainty he might have expected from a woman being mocked by the most powerful man in the valley. Something else entirely. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she said 3 words quietly enough that he shouldn't have been able to hear them across that distance, and yet somehow he did. "You will see." She turned back to her work. Hargrove watched her for another moment, his mare shifting beneath him. Then he clicked his tongue and rode on, still shaking his head, already composing the version of the story he would tell at the tavern that evening. It would get a good laugh. Everything about the Norwegian widow and her ridiculous tall house was going to get a good laugh. He did not know that 73 days later, he would be lying on the floor of that house, barely able to breathe, his wife and children huddled against him for warmth, alive only because of what that woman had built. He did not know that the 3 words she had spoken would follow him for the rest of his life. He rode on. The aspens kept falling, and in the lower meadow, Mara Voss kept building. She had arrived in the Sierra Nevada Valley in the spring of that year, coming off the train at Sacramento, and then north by wagon, asking directions with the careful precision of someone who has memorized a route but never traveled it before. The land agent in the small trading post near Donner Pass had looked at her with open skepticism when she told him what she wanted. "That parcel on the south-facing rise," she said. Her English was careful and accented, each word placed with deliberate attention. "Near the granite outcropping, 40 acres. "That's high ground," the agent said. "Good for avoiding floods, I suppose. But the winters up there are something else. The Donner Party got trapped near that very pass 40 years ago. You know about the Donner Party?" "I know about the Donner Party. 87 people, 42 dead, Right up there. He gestured vaguely northward. The pass is brutal from November through March. No road, no help if something goes wrong. A woman alone. How much for the 40 acres, he told her. She counted out the bills without expression. He took the money, signed the papers, and watched her fold her copy carefully into the front cover of a leather-bound journal that she carried in her coat pocket. "What do you plan to do up there?" he asked because he could not stop himself. Mara Voss looked at him with eyes the color of deep winter water. "Build something this valley needs," she said, whether it knows it or not. She walked out into the spring morning with her dog at her heel, a large, silver-gray Norwegian elkhound named Grim, moving with the quiet dignity of an animal who had seen things, and the agent stood in his doorway and watched her go and thought that he had never in 30 years of selling land to strangers seen anyone quite like her. He was right about that. To understand what Mara Voss was building and why you have to go back 4 years. You have to go back to Norway to a small mountain village whose name has no easy translation into English. A village that sat in a valley so deep the sun only reached its center for 6 hours a day. In winter, a village where snow was not a season but a presence, a permanent fact of life that shaped every decision from the height of doorways to the thickness of walls. Her father was Torstein Voss. In a village full of men who built their homes low and wide and practical, Torstein built differently. He built tall. He built with reinforced middle floors capable of bearing enormous weight. He built chimneys that rose 25 feet above the roofline. And most strangely, most inexplicably, to anyone who saw it for the first time, he built doors in his second-story walls positioned 10 feet above the ground, opening onto nothing but air. The villagers thought him eccentric at best. More often they said he was wasting timber on a man's vanity. Why build a door that opened onto nothing? Why spend money on a second floor when a single story was sufficient for any honest family? Why make chimneys so tall that the wind had to work twice as hard to push the smoke out? Torstein would explain. He had explained patiently over many years to anyone who would listen. He would describe what deep snow actually did, how it accumulated faster than any man could shovel, how it blocked doors and windows and chimneys until the family inside was sealed in darkness, how the carbon dioxide built up slowly and made people sleepy before it killed them, how the only escape from burial was upward, through a door positioned above the white tide. He would draw diagrams in the margins of his journal. He would calculate load weights and thermal dynamics in numbers that were 30 years ahead of what any engineering school in California was teaching. The villagers would nod politely and build their homes exactly as their fathers had built them. Torstein built only one double cabin, his own. Mara grew up in that house. She grew up understanding instinctively what her father had spent years trying to explain to others, the logic of it, the physics of it, the simple, terrible clarity of it. She had asked him when she was perhaps 9 years old why he didn't build double cabins for the other families too. He had looked at her with that particular expression she came to know well patient, a little sad, completely, without bitterness. "Because they haven't seen it yet," he said. "And people don't build what they haven't seen." "What will make them see?" He had been quiet for a long moment. "The storm will," he said. "The storm always does." He was right about that too. The storm came in February of 1882. It began on a Tuesday the way the worst things often do, quietly, without announcement, with snowflakes that seemed harmless as they drifted down from a sky the color of old pewter. By Wednesday evening, 3 feet had accumulated. By Thursday morning, 6. The temperature dropped so fast that the creek at the edge of the village froze solid between breakfast and noon. By Friday, the doors of every cabin in the village were blocked by walls of white. By Saturday, the screaming started. Mara remembered the sounds with the perfect, terrible clarity that certain experiences leave behind, not fading with time but sharpening, becoming more precise with each year, as though her memory had decided that this was something she was not permitted to forget. The muffled pounding of fists against wooden walls, voices calling names into the white silence. The way each voice would reach a certain pitch and then simply stop, not trailing away, but stopping as though a hand had covered a mouth. Her father made his decision on the third day. Torstein Voss strapped on the skis he had made himself, 10 feet long, designed to distribute a man's weight across deep powder, and opened the second-story door and stepped out onto the surface of the snow that had risen 15 feet above the ground. He looked back at Mara once. She was 28 years old. She was standing in the warm interior of the only house in the village that was not being buried alive. "Stay here," he said. "Keep the fire burning." "Father, keep the fire burning, Mara. That is your work right now." He turned and disappeared into the white. They found his body in the spring when the thaw came 3 months later. He had managed to dig out 7 people before his heart gave out, 7 souls pulled from frozen darkness alive because Torstein Voss had gone out into the worst storm in a generation. On skis, no one else in the village knew how to use carrying tools. No one else understood the purpose of. 47 people died in that storm. 7 were saved. Mara spent 5 days trying to reach her husband Eric and their 3-year-old son Nils, who had been at a neighbor's house when the storm hit 300 feet from the double cabin, a distance that might as well have been 300 miles. She dug tunnels that collapsed. She tried to navigate by landmarks that had vanished beneath the snow. She screamed names into the wind until her throat was raw, and nothing came back but silence. She broke through to the neighbor's cabin on the 5th day. The fire had died on the 2nd day. No one had come for them. She found Eric and Niels in the corner, together, the boy curled against his father's chest as though sleeping. Both of them still. Both of them gone. Mara sat in that frozen room for 4 hours. She held her husband's hand. She pressed her lips against her son's cold forehead. She said everything she had left to say, and then she sat in silence and let the silence complete her. Then she stood up. She went back through the tunnel she had dug. She climbed back into the house her father had built, and she sat down beside the fire, and she opened his journal and she began to read. She read for 3 days without stopping. When she was finished, she made 2 decisions. The first was that she would not stay in Norway. The second was that she would build her father's house in the place where it was needed most. She spent a month studying maps before she chose California. The Sierra Nevada range, the mountain passes, the elevation charts and the snowfall records, and the history of what happened to the 87 members of the Donner Party 40 years before she arrived. She read everything she could find. She corresponded with a professor at a university in Oslo who had studied North American weather patterns. She made calculations in the margins of her father's journal, filling the white space around his diagrams with her own numbers. Then she sold the family land for the sum of 63 American dollars, collected the journal and the skis her father had made, and booked passage on a ship bound for New York. Grim came with her. The dog had been Eric's, originally a 5-year-old Norwegian elk hound with silver-gray fur and eyes that held the kind of stillness that comes from having survived something serious. He had made it through the storm by staying close to the hearth. He was all that remained of the life Mara had lost. She crossed an ocean with a dog, a dead man's journal, and a set of hand-carved skis that were 10 feet long and made no sense to anyone who saw them. And she arrived at Donner Pass in the spring of 1886 knowing exactly what she was going to build, and why and how, knowing it the way you know the things that have been burned into you by loss, by cold, by the particular education that comes only from surviving what was supposed to kill you. She chose her building site with the attention of someone who understood that the choice itself was a form of engineering. A slight rise above the meadow giving her additional elevation, a southern exposure for maximum sunlight on the cold months, the granite outcropping to the northwest, a natural windbreak. She walked every inch of the 40 acres with Grim moving alongside her, the two of them spending the entire first month in what anyone watching might have mistaken for aimless wandering, but was in fact the most careful kind of study. Then she began to dig. The foundation went down 4 feet, deeper than any other structure in the valley. The hired men she brought in from Sacramento, 2 brothers named Randall and Joseph Pratt, experienced in heavy log construction and not given to asking unnecessary questions, watched her lay out the dimensions and said nothing. They had been hired to build what she showed them. They built it. By the end of May, the foundation was complete, and the first logs were rising. And the valley noticed. They came in 1s and 2s, at first stopping on the ridge road the way Hargrove would stop 2 months later, drawn by the strangeness of what was rising in the lower meadow. A 2-story structure with a frame so heavily reinforced it seemed designed for a building 3 times its size. A chimney of granite blocks that was already in late June rising higher than the roof lines of every other building within a mile. An interior floor between the stories built to a specification that no one in the valley had ever seen and none of them could explain. The questions came first, then the theories, then the mockery. Wade Pruitt arrived in early July with two friends from the mill, all three of them carrying bottles and looking for entertainment. He was 24 years old, broad-shouldered and loose-limbed, with the particular confidence of a young man who had not yet been shown what he did not know. He watched Mara work for a few minutes. Then he called out, "Wusso, what are you building? A barn for giants?" Mara did not look up from the log she was notching. Her hands did not pause. "Hey," Pruitt stepped closer. "I'm talking to you. I asked what you're building." She set down her tools and straightened her back and looked at him with an expression so completely without defensiveness that it seemed to confuse him. "A house," she said. "That's not a house. That's a... I don't know what that is." He turned to his friends. "Boys, I think we found ourselves the valley's newest fool." He turned back to Mara. "$20 says that thing falls before spring." Mara held his gaze for a moment. "I will remember that," she said. Then she picked up her tools and went back to work. Pruitt left laughing. But something in the way she had looked at him, patient, certain, without a trace of the embarrassment he had intended to cause, stayed with him in a way he did not examine until much later. Dr. Raymond Fitch came in August. He was a civil engineer from San Francisco, visiting the valley on business, and he stopped his carriage for nearly an hour to observe the construction before he finally approached. He was a careful man, precise in his speech, accustomed to being the most technically informed person in any room. He introduced himself. He explained his credentials. Then he opened his notebook. "The height-to-width ratio is unstable," he said. "You're building too tall for the base you've established. Any significant accumulation of snow on that roof will create a load-bearing stress that the walls cannot sustain. I can show you the calculations if..." "In Norway," Mara said quietly, "we say that the man who has seen the wolf does not need the man who has read about the wolf to explain how it hunts." Fitch blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I have seen what deep snow does to a cabin built the way you are describing. I have pulled frozen bodies from the wreckage of such cabins. I know what I am building and why I am building it." She looked at him steadily. "If you want to help, I have logs that need carrying." Fitch did not help carry the logs. He went back to town and reported to everyone at the general store that the Norwegian widow had refused the advice of a qualified engineer and was going to get herself killed when her ridiculous tall house collapsed under its own weight. He was very certain about this. He had the calculations to prove it. Reverend Samuel Croft made his visit in September. He was a lean, careful man who took his responsibilities seriously and believed that the spiritual welfare of his congregation extended to protecting them from outside influences that he did not understand. He had heard too many things about the woman in the lower meadow, her strange construction, her foreign ways, her solitary life without the guidance of a husband or a church. He came on a Wednesday morning and stood at the edge of the site with his Bible clasped against his chest. "I have heard troubling reports," he began. Mara was fitting the second-story doorframe. She paused in her work and looked down at him from above, literally above from the height of the second floor, which had a way of shifting the usual dynamics of a conversation that the Reverend did not entirely appreciate. "I build according to what works," she said before he could continue. "When the snow buries a man's house and he cannot breathe, does it matter whether his rescuer prays in Latin or Norwegian? When a mother freezes to death holding her child, does God ask which hymnal she used?" Croft had no immediate answer. "I will build what I know how to build," Mara continued. "When the snow comes, you will see whether my knowledge is dangerous or merely practical. Then you can decide what to do with your concern." He left without another word. But he spoke to his congregation that Sunday about foreign ways and the importance of seeking proper guidance, and the story of the Norwegian widow and her pagan construction grew in the telling until it had acquired details that bore only a loose relationship to anything that had actually happened. The most consequential visitor came in October. Desmond Holt was not a large man, but he carried himself in a way that suggested he believed himself to be. He owned the general store, a share in the mill, and a significant portion of the debt that various families in the valley had accumulated over lean years. He had a habit of arriving at moments of someone else's difficulty and leaving with something that had not been his before. He came on a Tuesday afternoon when the aspens were at their peak color, and he did not bother with the pretense of curiosity about the construction. "I'll give you $60 for this land," he said. "That's a fair price given the remoteness." "I paid $63 for it," Mara said. "Prices have dropped. And frankly, Miss Voss, this structure you're building is going to be a liability. When it collapses, it will not collapse. When it collapses, he repeated as though she had not spoken, you'll have nothing but debt and rubble. $60 is more than you'll get from anyone else. The land is not for sale. Holt studied her for a moment with the flat, assessing attention of a man who was accustomed to finding the number that changed people's minds. Then he shifted. You're a widow, he said. Lone up here, no family, no husband. The winters are going to be hard. A woman in your position could use someone to look out for her interests. He paused. I'm a widower myself. I'm suggesting we might come to a more permanent arrangement than a land sale. The silence that followed this had a particular quality. Mara set down her tools. She turned to face Holt with the full attention she rarely gave to interruptions, and she looked at him with an expression that was not anger and was not contempt, but was somehow more final than either of those things. Mr. Holt, she said, my father built a house that saved lives, and the villagers called him eccentric until the day he died, saving the people who had laughed at him. My husband died 300 feet from my door because no one built what my father built. I crossed an ocean with a poem in a dead man's journals to build something that this valley needs, whether it knows that yet or not. She picked up her tools again. I did not cross an ocean to find a new husband. The land is not for sale. Holt left. His expression as he rode away was not the expression of a man who had accepted a refusal. It was the expression of a man who had revised his approach. In the middle of all this, the mockery, the warnings, the unwanted advice, three people came to the building site without agenda. The first was Eleanor Briggs. She was 72 years old and she had lived in the Sierra Nevada Valley longer than anyone else breathing. She had arrived as a young bride in 1843, and she had survived the terrible winter of 1846 that had taken her husband and so many others, and she had watched the valley fill up with new families over the following 40 years, none of whom had any true understanding of what this land was capable of when the weather decided to mean business. She walked 3 miles to see the construction, arriving on a cool morning in late August, with no explanation of what had brought her there. She stood at the edge of the site for several minutes, studying the structure with the focused attention of someone looking for something specific. Then she walked slowly around the base of it. Then she looked up at the second-story door 10 feet above the ground, no stairs opening onto air. That door, she said, it's for when the snow covers everything else. Mara looked down at her. Yes. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. My husband went out to check on the horses in the storm of 46, she said. He made it to the barn, but when he tried to come back, the house was buried. He couldn't find the door. He walked in circles for 3 hours in the dark 20 feet from where I was sitting by the fire. She paused. They found him in the spring. She looked up at the door again. Then she looked at Mara. If we'd had a door like that up above the snow, he could have seen the light. He could have found his way home. Her voice did not shake. She had cried all the tears for that story 30 years ago. What remained was something harder and cleaner than grief. Can I help? Mara climbed down from the ladder. She stood in front of this old woman who had walked 3 miles on arthritic legs to understand what she was building, and felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of something she had not known was held tight. You can hand me nails, Mara said. Eleanor smiled. It transformed her whole face. Then I'll be here tomorrow, she said. She was. She came back the next day and the day after that and the week after that. She could not do heavy work, but she brought food and coffee and knowledge, 60 years of watching this valley's winters. The patterns she had noticed, the ways the weather announced itself before anyone else was paying attention. She asked questions with the directness of someone too old to waste time on unnecessary politeness. Tell me about the hearth, she said one morning in September, watching Mara and the Pratt brothers fit granite blocks into place. Why so large? That's twice the size of any fireplace I've seen. Heat rises, Mara said. In a 2-story structure, the fire must be large enough to warm both floors. But more importantly, the massive stone stores heat. Even when the fire dies down at night, these blocks continue radiating warmth for hours. In a long winter, when fuel must be conserved, that stored heat means the difference between life and death. Eleanor nodded, committing it to memory. And the chimney, 25 feet. My fireplace has a 12-foot chimney. When snow accumulates around a house and on its roof, it can block a shorter chimney. Block the chimney and 2 things happen. First, smoke fills the house. Second, more deadly, the fire consumes the oxygen inside without fresh air coming in. The family becomes sleepy before they understand why. They don't wake up. Eleanor's face went very still. The Morrison family, she said, Grundle. In 46, they found them all in their beds. Everyone said they had frozen. But the snow that year blocked their chimney, Mara said. Yes. Dear God. Eleanor looked up at the great stack of granite rising toward the sky. 25 feet of chimney won't be blocked by any ordinary snowfall. No, Mara said, it won't. The second ally came from an unexpected direction. Lars Bergman was a Swedish timber cutter who worked the upper forests and came down to the valley only when he had something to sell or something to buy. He was 38 years old, built like the trees he felled, with a beard that reached his chest and the careful eyes of a man who spent most of his time alone in the mountains and had learned to read weather and wood grain and silence with equal skill. He appeared at the construction site on a September afternoon and stood watching for nearly an hour before he spoke. Overvåningshus, he said finally, the Swedish word for the double cabin design. Mara turned sharply. You know that word? My grandfather built one in Sweden, in the valley of Dalarna. It saved 14 people in the Great Storm of 1860. He walked forward, examining the joinery of the logs with the hands of someone who knew what he was looking for. Your notching is Norwegian, different from Swedish style, but the principle is the same. He looked up at her. The principle doesn't care about borders. No, Mara agreed, it doesn't. Your father's name, Lars said carefully. Torstein Voss. I have heard it. In Sweden, among the men who study these things, they say he was a man who understood snow the way other men understand their own names. Mara had not heard her father's name spoken with respect since she left Norway. Something in her throat closed briefly. He was, she said. Lars looked at the construction for another moment. I will help you, he said. 3 days, no payment. This knowledge should not be lost. He paused. And it should not be lost because a woman building it alone ran out of strength before she finished. He stayed for 3 days and he worked without complaint, lifting the heaviest logs into the positions that had been waiting for someone with his particular kind of strength. On the second day, as they were fitting the reinforced middle floor into place, the floor that would, though neither of them said so aloud, bear the weight of however many people needed to shelter, there, when the time came, Lars spoke without looking up from his work. Why here, he said. You could have gone somewhere easier. California has valleys where snow never falls. Mara drove a peg into the joint she was securing. Because here is where the snow kills people, she said. Here is where my father's knowledge is needed. What is the use of knowing how to survive deep winter if you live somewhere winter never comes? Lars was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once and went back to work. He left on the third day, shook Mara's hand without unnecessary ceremony, and returned to his timber cutting. He told no one about the double cabin. Some knowledge he believed should be allowed to prove itself before it was shared. The third ally came with a basket of bread. Wade Pruitt, the young man who had offered $20 that the cabin would collapse before spring, had not forgotten about the construction site after his initial visit. He told himself he was not interested. He found himself riding past the lower meadow more often than his routes required. He told himself he was checking on something else. What he was actually doing was watching. He watched the walls rise. He watched the chimney grow. He watched the reinforced floor go in, and the second-story door frame, and the steep pitch of the roof that was unlike anything he had seen in the valley. He did not understand what he was seeing, but something in the precision of it, the way each decision seemed to connect to every other decision. Nothing arbitrary, nothing decorative, everything serving a purpose he could not yet name, kept pulling him back. He did not return to the site in person. His $20 bet was still on the table at the tavern, and he had a reputation to maintain. But he watched, and something was beginning to move in him, some understanding that had not yet found its way into words. The cabin was completed on the 15th of November, 1886. It stood 20 feet tall and 18 feet wide and 24 feet deep. The walls were Douglas fir logs, each 18 inches in diameter, notched and fitted with a precision that left no gap for wind to enter. The roof was steeply pitched, covered with wooden shingles cut 3 inches thick. The chimney rose 25 feet above the roof line, the highest point within a quarter mile. The ground floor held storage firewood stacked to the ceiling along the north wall, enough to burn continuously for 4 months. barrels of salted meat and dried fish, sacks of flour and cornmeal, 3 barrels of fresh water alongside the equipment for melting snow into more. The second floor held the living quarters, a bed frame built to last generations, a small cooking area connected to the massive hearth below, a desk where Mara kept her father's journal, windows on all 4 sides giving clear sight lines in every direction, including unobstructed views of the neighboring properties across the meadow. The second-story door faced south. It was positioned 10 feet above the ground. Outside it, Mara had built a small platform with hooks for hanging the 10-foot skis that had been her father's, that had carried him across the surface of the Norwegian snow on the day he went out and did not come back. No stairs led up to that door from the outside. From the ground, it looked like a door to nowhere. From above in deep snow, it would look like the only way home. Desmond Holt came back on the day after the completion, as Mara had known he would. He stood with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back, and he looked at the finished structure with the expression of a man recalculating. "I'll give you $80, he said. "The land is not for sale," Mara said. "100. "Mr. Holt, this valley is going to turn against you," he said, his voice dropping, losing the businesslike tone and finding something underneath it that was closer to the truth. "You're a foreign woman building something nobody asked for and nobody wants. I'm offering you a way out before it gets harder." Mara looked at him for a long moment. "My father was told the same thing," she said, "that nobody wanted what he was building, that he was wasting his time and his timber on something that made no sense to anyone around him." She paused. "He built it anyway, because he understood something the people around him did not yet understand." She turned toward the cabin door. "I am his daughter. The land is not for sale." Holt rode away with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had not finished thinking about something. 3 days later, the cold snap arrived. It dropped the valley to 15 below zero, not a true blizzard, not the storm that was coming, but cold enough to make the point. Mara spent that night in the second-floor living quarters with Grim, lying beside the hearth, and the massive stones radiated heat through the floorboards and up into the space around her. The air gap between the inner and outer roof layers held warmth against the cold outside like a hand cupped around a flame. She sat at her father's desk in her shirt sleeves and read his journal by candlelight. Outside, the valley shivered and burned through wood at a rate that would matter when the real cold came. Eleanor came the next morning, stamping frost from her boots at the second-story door. She stepped inside and stopped. "It's warmer in here than my house with the stove running all day," she said, genuine wonder in her voice. "How?" "This is nothing," Mara said. "This cold is mild. The test will come later." Eleanor looked at her. "How much later?" Mara turned to the window and studied the western sky. The color of it, the way the clouds sat against the mountains, the pressure she could feel in the air when she breathed. She had seen that color before. In Norway. In February of 1882, 4 days before the storm that buried her village and took her husband and son and father and everyone else she had ever known. "Not long," she said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "How bad?" Mara thought about the birds that had left the valley 3 weeks ahead of schedule. She thought about the unusual depth of the holes Grim had been digging around the cabin's foundation. She thought about the way the horses in Hargrove's stable had been pacing and snorting at shadows for the past week. "Worse than anything this valley has seen in 40 years, she said. Eleanor made a small sound that was not quite a word. She looked out the window at the frost-white meadow, the frozen creek, the ridge where the aspens had gone bare too early. "God help us," she said. "God helps those who prepare," Mara replied. "Go, tell people what I've told you. Tell them to stack their wood beside their beds. Tell them to clear their chimneys. Tell them to find their highest windows and know how to break the glass if they need to." She paused. "Some of them will listen. Those are the ones who will survive." "Most of them won't listen," Eleanor said. "No," Mara agreed. "Most of them won't." Eleanor left to do what she could. Mara watched her go from the second-story window, this old woman, 72 years old, walking back out into the cold morning to warn people who would not believe her, because warning them was the right thing to do. And Eleanor Briggs had never in her life let difficulty talk her out of the right thing. Mara turned from the window. She went to the desk and opened her father's journal and found the last entry he had written before the storm, before he strapped on his skis and opened the second-story door and stepped out onto the white and disappeared forever. The handwriting was steady, unhurried. The handwriting of a man who had made peace with what he was about to do. Build it tall enough that they can always find their way home. Mara read the words once. Then she closed the journal. Outside, the sky to the west was changing color. Slowly, subtly, the way the most serious things always begin, with a shift so gradual that anyone not paying close attention would miss it entirely. Pewter, darkening towards something older, something heavier. She had seen that color before. She knew exactly what it meant. She moved to the center of the second floor, where the great hearth sent warmth up through the stones and into the floorboards and into the soles of her feet. Grim lifted his head from his blanket and looked at her with those steady silver eyes. Soon, she said quietly. The word was not just for the dog. It was a promise to the valley below the valley that had laughed and warned and dismissed and tried to buy her out and tried to marry her out, and had not once in all those months stopped to ask the only question that mattered. Not whether a woman should build a house like this, not whether a foreigner had the right to build something no one had asked for, but whether, when the sky turned that particular shade of old pewter in the west, and the birds had already left, and the horses were restless, and the dog was digging holes around the foundation, whether anyone in this valley actually knew what was coming. The answer was the same as it had been in Norway. It was always the same. The ones who had seen it knew. The ones who hadn't didn't. And in 72 hours, give or take, they were all going to find out which kind of knowledge actually mattered when the sky finally delivered what it had been promising. Mara Voss sat down at her father's desk. She opened the journal to a fresh page, and she began to write. The storm began on the morning of December 23rd, 1886. It started the way the worst things always start, gently, almost apologetically, with snowflakes so small and dry, they seemed more like an afterthought than a warning. By breakfast, there was barely an inch on the ground. The sky was the color of old pewter, the same color Mara had been watching for 3 weeks, but low and still, without the dramatic quality that people expected from dangerous weather. It looked like an ordinary winter morning. It felt like one. The valley went about its business. Cornelius Hargrove rode out to check his north fence line before the snow got worse. He figured he had until afternoon. He figured the whole thing would blow itself out by nightfall. He had survived 30 winters in these mountains, and he trusted his judgment the way men trust things that have never yet failed them. In town, families were finishing their Christmas preparations. The general store had stayed open late the previous 2 evenings to accommodate last-minute purchases. Reverend Croft was finalizing his Christmas Eve sermon. Children were watching the first snowflakes fall with the uncomplicated joy that belongs entirely to people who have not yet learned what snow can become. In the lower meadow, Mara had been awake since 3 in the morning. She had felt the pressure change in the night, a shift in the air so subtle that most people would not have been able to name it, but that she recognized the way you recognize the sound of a voice you have not heard in years. She had risen in the darkness and gone to every window and looked at the sky, and what she saw told her everything she needed to know. She spent the hours before dawn moving the last of what needed moving. The remaining firewood from the ground floor went up the interior ladder to the second level, stacked along the north wall, until it reached the ceiling. Every blanket, every medical supply, every barrel of water that could be lifted. She worked steadily and without urgency, the way her father had always worked, because urgency was for people who had not prepared far enough in advance, and Mara had been preparing it for this since February of 1882. By the time the first pale light came through the eastern windows, she was ready. She sat down at the desk and looked out at the meadow below and watched the snow begin. By noon, it was 6 inches. By the time the light began to fail in the early mountain dusk, it was 1 foot. The temperature, which had been in the low 20s during the brief daylight, began to drop as darkness came. Not gradually, quickly. The kind of drop that has intention behind it, that means to go somewhere specific and is not interested in stopping along the way. By midnight, it was 10 below zero and the wind had begun. Not the howling theatrical wind of lesser storms, the kind that announces itself and gives people time to prepare. This wind came in low and steady and relentless, not screaming, but pressing, leaning against every wall and window and sealed door in the valley with the quiet persistence of something that has all the time in the world and knows it. Hargrove woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of his horses. They were not making the normal sounds of horse disturbed by weather. They were making the sounds of animals that understood at some level beneath language that something was wrong in a way that went beyond ordinary discomfort. He pulled on his boots and his heaviest coat and went to the barn. It took him 20 minutes to cover ground he normally crossed in 3. The snow was past his knees. In the darkness, he could not see the fence line 10 feet away. He calmed the horses. He checked the barn doors. He started back toward the house and realized for one disorienting moment that he could not immediately determine which direction it was. He found his way home by following the rope he had strung between the house and barn the previous October, a habit from a bad storm 15 years ago that he had maintained ever since without thinking about it much. He stepped through the back door and stamped the snow from his boots and stood in his kitchen and looked at his wife. "How bad?" she asked. He thought about the moment of disorientation, the darkness and the wind and the whiteness that had swallowed every landmark, the horse's eyes. "Stock more wood," he said, "right now. Bring as much as you can from the pile." He did not say what he was thinking, which was that the pile outside was already half buried and he had not stocked nearly as much inside as he should have. He had not listened to the old woman's warning. He had not listened to his horses. He had not listened to the Norwegian widow, but then nobody had expected to listen to her. He started hauling wood and told himself it would be enough. It was not enough. Christmas Eve morning came gray and absolute. 3 feet of snow on the ground and still falling. The wind at 30 miles per hour with gusts that hit 50 driving the snow horizontally so that visibility dropped to the length of a man's arm. The temperature had settled at 20 below zero and gave no indication of moving in a warmer direction. The valley was no longer a valley. It was a white country of uncertain borders, the familiar landmarks, fence lines, tree clusters, the road to town, the creek having disappeared entirely beneath a surface that looked solid and smooth and gave no indication of what it had swallowed. From the second-story window of the double cabin, Mara could see the roof lines of the nearest neighbors' houses barely visible above the drifts. She could see the smoke from their chimneys. She watched those smoke columns throughout the day with the attention of a doctor watching a patient's breathing, reading in their thickness and color and steadiness a story about the condition of the families below. Hargrove's chimney was producing heavy smoke. He had wood. But the pile she could see at the corner of his house had shrunk dramatically since yesterday and was disappearing under fresh snow at a rate that she calculated with the part of her mind that had been running numbers since before dawn. The Fitch cabin, where the engineer from San Francisco was staying, had a chimney that had never been tall enough. 12 feet. Standard construction, perfectly adequate for a normal winter. This was not a normal winter. She watched the Fitch chimney throughout the morning of Christmas Eve. In the afternoon, something she had been expecting arrived. It was the knock on the second-story door that brought her there. Eleanor stood in the doorway, snow-covered and breathing hard, having crossed 200 meters of thigh-deep snow, with the determined stubbornness of a woman who had decided that dying alone was not an option she was willing to accept. She was carrying a bag. Inside the bag was a supply of medicines she had prepared the previous week, bandaging material, a bottle of laudanum dried herbs for fever, a package of hard biscuits, a jar of dried meat. "You didn't think," she said, stepping inside and stomping snow from her boots, "that I was going to sit in my house and wait." Mara looked at her, this 72-year-old woman who had just crossed 200 meters of chest-high drifts while alone in a whiteout, and felt something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but was a combination of the two that had no single name. "I thought you might be sensible," Mara said. "I have lived too long to be sensible," Eleanor replied. She set down her bag and looked around the second floor, the stacked firewood, the organized supplies, the windows giving sight lines in every direction, the warmth that was almost shocking after the cold outside. "Now, what do we do first?" They spent Christmas Eve together, the two of them, watching the storm build from the second-story windows, while the great hearth burned steady and the stacked wood diminished slowly, and the stones radiated their stored warmth into the floor, in the air, and the bones of both women. Grim moved between them, settling beside Eleanor, when she sat returning to Mara when she stood. The dog had been quiet since the storm began. Not anxious, not restless. Something more like prepared, the stillness of an animal that has experienced serious weather and knows the value of conserving everything. Through the day and into the night of Christmas Eve, the snow kept falling. By midnight, it was 3 feet deeper than it had been at dawn, 4 feet total on the ground. The wind had not decreased. Mara did not sleep. Christmas Day, 1886. 5 additional feet fell in the night, 9 feet total by Christmas morning. Mara stood at the south window as the pale excuse for daylight arrived and looked out at a world that had been fundamentally altered. The roof lines of the nearest houses were still visible, but only just the drifts had risen to the eaves of most single-story structures, and the wind was piling the snow in waves against every vertical surface it encountered. The smoke columns were thinner. Hargrove's chimney still producing smoke but noticeably reduced from the previous day. He was rationing his wood, or he was running out of it. The Nolan house where Beatrice Nolan lived with her extended family had smoke that was barely a thread. Either they were burning very slowly, or the fire was struggling to draw properly. And the Fitch cabin's chimney was producing smoke in irregular puffs. Not the steady column of a fire burning well, but the uncertain exhalations of a fire being fed too little fuel against too much cold, a fire beginning to lose the argument it was having with the temperature. "He's in trouble," Eleanor said, appearing at Mara's shoulder. "He's been in trouble since yesterday afternoon," Mara said. "The chimney is the wrong height. When the snow drifts high enough against the lee wall." "How long?" Mara studied the Fitch chimney. The puffs were becoming less frequent, the smoke lighter in color. "Tomorrow," she said. "Maybe sooner." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "And the others?" "Hargrove has wood, but not enough. The Nolans—" She paused. "The Nolans are already burning furniture." Eleanor absorbed this. "When do we go?" It was the question Mara had been turning over since before dawn. Not whether to go. That had never been in question. When and in what order, and how to get back each time, and how to keep herself functional through multiple trips across 15 feet of snow in temperatures that were now, according to the thermometer outside the south window, holding at 30 below zero. "Not yet," Mara said. "The wind has to drop enough to see. Right now I couldn't find the Hargrove house in that." She gestured at the white nothing beyond the glass. "I'd walk past it without knowing." Eleanor nodded. She understood. She had been married to a man who had died 20 feet from his own door because he couldn't see it in the white. "When the wind dropped," Mara said, "I go." The wind dropped on the afternoon of December 26th, the third day. Not completely, it continued at a sustained 20 miles per hour, driving the falling snow in a way that cut visibility to 30 or 40 feet. But the gusting had subsided. The world had gone from a condition of pure violent chaos to something that might, with difficulty and the right equipment, be navigated. Mara had been watching the Fitch chimney all morning. At 11:45, the smoke stopped. Not thinning, not fading, stopped. One moment there was a thread of gray against the white sky, and the next moment there was nothing. The snow had reached the top of the 12-foot chimney. Inside that cabin, the fire would continue burning for a short while longer, consuming whatever oxygen remained in the sealed space. When the oxygen was gone, the family inside would begin to feel sleepy. They would not understand why. They would lie down to rest. They would not wake up. Eleanor had been watching from the opposite window. She turned to Mara without speaking. Mara was already reaching for her coat. There is a silence that lives inside a deep winter storm that is different from any other silence in the world. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of presence, of something massive and indifferent, holding the air in its hands so completely that the ordinary sounds of human life, the creak of a hinge, the bark of a bee, the voice of a child calling from one room to another become impossible. Not muffled. Impossible. As though the world that made those sounds had never existed. Mara stepped out through the second-story door and stood on the platform above the snow and felt that silence settle around her like water. The storm was still moving. Snow still fell. The wind still pushed. But compared to the previous 2 days, the air was almost navigable, and from the platform she could see dimly through 30 feet of visibility the outlines of what the valley had become. It was 15 feet deep, perhaps more in the drifted areas against walls and fences. The smooth surface stretched in every direction, broken only by the dark tips of the tallest pine trees and the occasional angular shadow of a roofline barely clearing the white. The familiar landscape had been erased. The meadow, the road, the creek, the fence lines, all of it gone, replaced by a country of white that had its own geography, its own hills and valleys, shaped by wind rather than by earth. She strapped on her father's skis, 10 feet long, hand-carved from ash wood designed to distribute a man's weight or a woman's weight across the deep powder, preventing sinkage, allowing movement across a surface that would otherwise swallow a person whole. She took the lantern. She hung it from a pole she could carry above her head, a beacon for finding her way back in deteriorating visibility. She tucked the coil of rope inside her coat to lower people through the tunnel she would have to dig to pull those who could not move themselves. She looked at Grim. The dog was standing at the platform's edge, watching her with those steady silver eyes. He wanted to come. His whole body said so, the set of his shoulders, the forward lean of his weight. "Stay with Eleanor," Mara said. "Stay warm." Grim looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the edge and sat down, watching. Mara turned to face the white. She had stood in this position before, not literally, not on this platform in this valley, but she had stood in the exact same position in Norway on the morning of the 5th day, when she had finally broken through the snow toward the cabin where her husband and son lay dead. She had stood at the edge of the impossible and looked at it and then stepped into it because there was no other option that she could live with. Her father had stood in the same position, in the same valley, on the 3rd day of a different storm, and he had stepped out onto the white and not come back. She understood in that moment, with the cold burning her exposed skin and the silence pressing against her from every direction, that she was not doing this despite what had happened to him. She was doing it because of it. She was the child of a man who had chosen to go knowing the con because 7 people were trapped in the snow, and the cost of not going was something he could not carry. She had been carrying what he had left behind for 4 years. It was time to put it down the only way it could actually be put down. She pushed off with the poles. The skis carried her forward across the surface of the snow, her weight distributed across 10 feet of length, moving with a speed and ease that would have seemed impossible to anyone watching from below. She oriented herself by the geometry. She had memorized the angle of the ridge, the distance she had measured and remeasured from her platform to each neighboring structure, the slight depressions in the snow's surface, where the heat from below was causing marginally faster settling. The Hargrove house was her first destination. She found it by the depression and by memory, arriving at a point on the snow's surface that her calculations said should be directly above the chimney. She probed with her pole, solid 6 inches below the surface. She cleared it and leaned down. "Hello," she called into the darkness below. "Can anyone hear me?" Silence. Then faint, filtered through 15 feet of snow and wood and frozen air, a voice. "Help us. The children. Please, Martha Hargrove." Her voice stripped of everything except the essential, the one request that a mother makes when everything else has been reduced to its core. "I am coming down," Mara called. "Stay away from the chimney. I will reach your door." She began to dig. The work was brutal in a way that went beyond physical difficulty. The snow at 15 feet of depth was not the light powder of the surface. It was compressed and heavy, packed by its own weight into something approaching the consistency of wet sand. Each shovelful resisted. The walls of the tunnel she was digging kept threatening to collapse inward. The cold 30 below, perhaps colder in the windless pocket she was working in, was a constant presence, seeking every gap in her clothing, working at the seal between her gloves and her sleeves, finding the small, exposed triangle of skin between her collar and her hat. She did not stop. She thought about her father, about the patience he had always moved with, the absence of hurry. That was not slowness, but something else, the understanding that the work required what it required, and giving it less than that was not an option. She thought about Niels, about the curl of her son's small body against his father's chest in that frozen room, about the specific angle of Eric's old arm where it had come to rest around the boy in the last moments when warmth was still something they had. She dug. 3 hours after she had stepped off the platform of the double cabin, her shovel struck the door of the Hargrove house. She forced it open against the drift of snow that had compressed against it, and a wave of dead cold air came out. Not the cold of the outside, but the cold of an enclosed space that has lost its heat, the cold of walls that have stopped protecting and started merely containing. Martha Hargrove was in the corner with her 3 children pressed against her, all of them wrapped in every blanket and piece of clothing that had been within reach. Their lips were blue. Their movements were the slow, uncertain movements of people whose bodies were working very hard to maintain a temperature that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Cornelius Hargrove was on the floor near the dead fireplace, unconscious, his hands still wrapped around the handle of an axe. He had been trying to chop through the wall, trying to create an opening for air, and his body had stopped cooperating before he finished the task. The youngest child, a girl perhaps 4 years old, looked up at Mara with eyes that were too large and too quiet in a face that should have had color in it. Mara did not stop moving. "Can you walk?" she asked Martha. Yes, I think so." "The children?" "I don't know. The little ones? We carry them." Mara was already crouching beside Cornelius, assessing, alive, breathing, too heavy to carry alone over 15 feet of vertical snow. "Your husband first, through the tunnel. I have a rope." It took 2 hours to get 5 people out of that hole and across the snow to the double cabin. Martha could walk, but barely. Cornelius had to be dragged on the makeshift sled that Mara had pulled behind her for exactly this purpose. The two older children managed the tunnel on their own. The youngest, the girl with the two large eyes, Mara carried against her chest with one arm while she moved the sled with the other. When they came through the second-story door of the double cabin and felt the wall of warmth hit them, Martha Hargrove made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, but was the sound a person makes when the body understands before the mind does that it is going to be allowed to survive. Eleanor was already there with blankets and hot water and the particular competence of a woman who has been waiting to be useful and knows exactly how. Mara did not rest. She turned around and went back out. The Nolan house was next. She found it lower than expected. The drifts on the western side had piled higher than her calculations had accounted for, and the structure itself had settled visibly under the weight above it. The chimney, when she cleared it and called down, produced a response. Beatrice Nolan's voice, thinner than Mara expected, but present. What she found when she broke through the door was a family that had made it barely by burning everything combustible in the house that was not structural. The furniture, the floorboards in 2 rooms, a collection of books that had kept the fire going through the worst of the previous night. And in the corner, wrapped in what appeared to be every curtain in the house, a woman Mara did not recognize, holding something very small against her chest. "She came last night," Beatrice said. Her voice carried the particular stripped quality of someone who has been operating for too long at the edge of their reserves. "We didn't expect her until February." Then the something very small moved. Mara crossed the room and looked at the infant newborn, 6 hours old at most, born into a frozen house in the middle of a blizzard that had buried the valley under 15 feet of snow. The baby's lips had a bluish cast. Her fingers were the wrong color. Mara opened her coat without hesitation. She took the infant and pressed her against her own chest and closed the coat around them both. Against her sternum, Boyo felt the baby shiver, once a full-body tremor, the involuntary response of a system that is cold enough to be frightened, and then stillness. And then gradually against the heat of Mara's body, a different kind of stillness. The stillness of something that is beginning cautiously to believe it might be warm enough to continue. They made it back to the double cabin. Mara handed the baby to Eleanor and turned around. Reverend Croft she found kneeling. He had been praying for 12 hours by the time she broke through his door, and when he looked up and saw her standing in the opening, she had made snow-covered and exhausted, her face bearing the marks of hours in 30 below cold. He did not speak for a long time. "You came," he finally said. The words came out simple and unguarded in the way that very tired people sometimes achieve. "I came for everyone," Mara said. "Can you walk?" Yes." "Then come." He came. He did not ask how she had gotten there. He did not ask how she was going to get him back. He pulled on his coat and followed her into the tunnel she had dug and emerged on the surface of the snow and followed her across the white on the boards she had laid for him to walk on. And he said nothing at all until they came through the second-story door and he saw the room full of people. Hargrove and his family, the Nolans, the woman with the newborn, all of them alive, all of them warming, all of them in the house that everyone had called a lighthouse for a sea that didn't exist. He sat down on the floor and put his face in his hands. Mara was already moving. Wade Pruitt she found alone. His family had gone to town for Christmas shopping 2 days before the storm hit and had been unable to return. He had spent the 3 days of the storm first rationing his wood, then burning furniture, then trying to dig his way out and collapsing from the effort. When Mara broke through his door, he was lying on his side on the floor near the cold fireplace, conscious but with the slow, uncertain movements of advanced hypothermia. His right hand was the wrong color. Two fingers, the index and the middle, had gone a deep blackish purple that meant the tissue was past the point of simple cold and into something more permanent. He looked up at her. "I bet $20, he said. His speech was slow, each word requiring separate effort. "Your cabin, that it would fall." "You can pay me back," Mara said, and already wrapping his hand in the cloth she had brought for exactly this kind of injury by learning to build one. She got him back to the double cabin and put his hand in Eleanor's care and went out again. It was on the fifth day, December 27th, that she reached the Fitch cabin. She had been saving it, not from reluctance, not from any calculation of deserving, but because the reports she had been reading in the smoke and the snow told her that the Fitch structure had problems beyond a blocked chimney. The settling pattern of the snow around it was wrong. There were places where the surface had dropped in a way that meant something below had shifted. She was right, the roof had partially collapsed. She knew it the moment her shovel broke through to the interior air, a different quality to the darkness below, a wrongness in the angles of what she could see by lantern light. One of the main roof beams had given way under the accumulated weight, dropping a section of the roof into the living space. The walls were beginning to buckle inward where the load distribution had been compromised. It had collapsed exactly as Mara had known it would collapse, in the manner she had described to Doctor Fitch on the August afternoon when he had stood in front of her construction site with his notebook explaining why her design was structurally unsound. She found him pinned beneath the fallen beam. He was conscious. His eyes tracked her lantern when she held it up. He was cold. Very cold, but alive. His legs beneath the beam were not moving in the way that raised a specific concern she filed away for Eleanor to assess. "Leave me," he said. His voice was thin and careful, the voice of a man managing pain by speaking slowly. "You cannot carry me out alone. Save yourself." "My father did not ask people if they deserved to be saved," Mara said. She assessed the beam. She assessed the snow above. She assessed the angles and the weights and the available leverage with the same focused attention she gave to every structural problem. Then she began to work. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of digging through rubble and snow simultaneously, of repositioning the beam, by degrees of constructing a makeshift support from the wreckage of the collapsed roof to hold what remained of the structure above her while she worked. 4 hours in a space that was becoming progressively less stable, where any significant shift could bring the rest of the roof down on both of them. She did not stop. She thought about her father on the skis in the Norwegian snow. She thought about 7 people alive because he had gone out and not come back. She thought about what the number meant, not just 7 people, but everyone. Those 7 people had touched everyone. Their children had become everyone who had been warmed by a fire that would have gone out if Torstein Voss had decided that the storm was too much and stayed inside. Numbers compounded. That was what her father had understood. Every life saved became a branching thing, a tree growing outward through time, and the person who chose not to save it could never know the full shape of what they had prevented. She pulled Fitch free at the end of the 4th hour. He could not stand. She constructed the sled from what remained of his broken furniture, and she dragged him back across the snow, and it took 3 hours, and by the time they came through the second-story door of the double cabin, Mara could not feel her hands. Eleanor took one look at her and steered her toward the hearth without speaking. Fitch lay on the floor of the room that he had once declared structurally unsound and looked up at the ceiling and the walls and the roof that had not given way under several tons of accumulated snow. His expression was the expression of a man encountering a fact that requires him to revise a significant portion of what he believed he knew. "I have been a structural engineer for 23 years, he said. The room was quiet enough to hear him clearly. "I have never seen anything as perfectly suited to its purpose as this building." He paused. "I was wrong about the calculations, about the design." Another pause longer. "About everything structurally speaking." Someone near the back of the room made a sound. It might have been exhaustion. It might have been the specific release that comes when something that has been held very tight finally loosens, and it became a laugh. And the laugh spread through the room, quiet and genuine, and a little ragged around the edges, the way laughter sounds when it comes from people who have been very close to not being there to laugh at all. By the morning of December 28th, there were 23 people in the double cabin, 23 souls in a structure designed comfortably for 6. They lay on every surface. They shared blankets and warmth in the particular intimacy that comes from surviving something together. The firewood that Mara had stacked burned continuously in the great hearth. The food she had stored fed hungry mouths. Eleanor moved among them with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been waiting her whole life to be exactly this useful, and the newborn Nolan girl slept in warmth against her grandmother's chest, and the sounds of the storm outside, which had by now settled into a steady, persistent fall, rather than the full violence of its earlier days, were the sounds of something that had done its worst and been answered. Emma Hargrove Cornelius's youngest 8 years old, the one Mara had carried back from the frozen house, had not spoken since she arrived. She sat with her back against the wall nearest the hearth and watched the room with eyes that had seen enough in the previous 2 days that words seemed inadequate to whatever was happening inside her. Grim had been beside her since the moment she arrived. Not pressed against her, not demanding attention, but present the large silver-gray dog settling at a careful distance that was close enough to be felt but far enough to be chosen. He lay with his head on his paws and his eyes open, watching her with the steady, unhurried attention that he gave to things he had decided required his full consideration. For several hours, Emma watched the room. Grim watched Emma. Then in a voice so quiet that only the people nearest her heard it, Emma Hargrove spoke her first words since the frozen house. "Can I pet him?" The room did not go silent. It was already as quiet as a room with 23 people in it could be, but something shifted. Several people who had been sleeping opened their eyes. Eleanor across the room became very still. Mara was beside the hearth, her hands finally warming the feeling, returning in stages. She turned. She crossed the room and crouched down to the height of the small girl against the wall. "His name is Grim," she said. Her voice was steady. "He belonged to my husband." The girl looked at the dog. Grim's tail moved once slowly against the floorboards. "Where is your husband?" Emma asked. The question came out with the uncomplicated directness of a child who is too tired for anything except the straightest line between what she wants to know and the asking of it. Mara held the girl's gaze. "He died in a storm like this one," she said, "in Norway, before I came here." Emma absorbed this. Her small hand moved toward Grim, tentative, and then committed, and the dog raised his head and rested it against her fingers with the careful gentleness of an animal who understands what is fragile. "I'm sorry," Emma said. "Thank you," Mara said. The room breathed. Outside, the storm was finally slowing. Not stopping, not yet, but the quality of it had changed the way a fever changes in the small hours before dawn. The worst was past. What remained was the settling, the diminishing, the slow return of a world that had been suspended. Mara stood and walked to the south window. She looked out at the white that stretched to the horizon and beyond, covering everything that had been there before, and she thought about what lay beneath it. The cabins, some of them broken. The animals that had not been moved inside in time. The road to town that would not be passable for weeks. The 3 people she had not been able to reach: the elderly couple on the far side of the valley, the young man who had tried to walk to town on Christmas Eve, whose fires had gone cold before she could get to them. She thought about them the way her father had thought about the 40 people he had not been able to save, with the specific weight of the ones you know you could not have reached, different from the weight of the ones you might have reached if you had been faster, stronger, better prepared. She let herself feel that weight. She did not put it down. She did not minimize it. She held it for as long as it needed to be held, and she looked out at the white country that had been a valley, and she acknowledged without flinching the full cost of what the storm had taken. Then she turned back to the room. 23 people, alive, warm, fed. Some of them sleeping, some of them talking quietly, some of them looking at the ceiling with the particular expression of people who are still processing the fact of their own survival. 23 people who would not have been there if her father had not spent his life building something that everyone told him was unnecessary. 23 people who would not have been there if she had stayed in Norway. She looked at Eleanor, who was sitting near the hearth with the Nolan infant in her arms, and Eleanor looked back at her, and in that exchange was everything that needed to be said and nothing that needed to be spoken aloud. Mara crossed to the hearth and added a careful measure of wood to the fire. The flames took it without hesitation. The stones radiated their steady warmth into the floor and the walls and the air of the room. Outside, the snow fell on. The sun came back on the morning of December 29th, 1886. It appeared without announcement the way the most important things often do, not gradually brightening through cloud cover, but simply there a pale disk in a sky that had gone overnight from the heavy pewter of the storm to a blue so clear and absolute it seemed painted by someone who had never heard of subtlety. The light that came through the south windows of the double cabin was the light of a world that had been through something and was now cautiously beginning again. Mara had been awake for an hour before it arrived. She had sat at her father's desk in the pre-dawn quiet, listening to the breathing of 23 people distributed across every available surface of the second floor, and she had opened his journal to a blank page and written down the names. All 23, the Hargrove family, the Nolans, Reverend Croft, Dr. Fitch, Wade Pruitt, the others she had pulled from the white one by one across 3 days of cold that had no interest in whether any of them survived it. She wrote the names the way her father had written his calculations, carefully, without ornamentation, because the thing itself was enough. When the sun came through the gauze and fell across the page, she closed the journal. She went to the window. The valley below, or where the valley had been, was a sea of white so complete and so still that it took the breath away. The surface caught the new sunlight and threw it back in 1,000 directions, a brilliance that hurt the eyes and made the familiar landscape entirely unrecognizable. What had been meadows and fence lines and creek beds and the road to town was now a single smooth country, broken only by the dark tips of the tallest pines and the occasional angular interruption of a roof line where a structure had held against the weight above it. Many had not held. She could see the places where they hadn't, the particular flatness, where a roof had given way, the subtle depressions where walls had buckled inward, the absence of smoke that told the story of what the storm had taken. Behind her, people were beginning to wake. They came out through the second-story door, one by one, stepping onto the platform, and then down onto the snow surface on the wide boards Mara had laid for exactly this purpose, and each of them stopped when they saw it. The valley that was not a valley anymore. The white country that had swallowed their world and now sat in the new December sunlight with the magnificent indifference of something that had no opinion about what it had done. Cornelius Hargrove came out third, moving carefully on legs that still bore the uncertainty of someone who had been horizontal and near death 2 days before. He stood on the snow and looked south and north and west, and his face went through several expressions in succession that he did not try to control. "Dear God," he said quietly, "it's beautiful." "It's a graveyard," Mara said from where she stood at the edge of the platform. Her voice was not unkind, it was simply accurate. Beneath that beauty, there are frozen animals and broken structures and 3 people who did not make it through. The beauty doesn't change what's underneath it. Hargrove looked at her. The silence between them held everything that had happened in the previous 72 hours, the tunnel she had dug to reach his door, the 2 hours it had taken to get his family across the snow, the moment he had regained consciousness on the floor of this cabin and looked up and understood what had happened and who had made it happen. He did not try to fill the silence with anything inadequate. It was mid-morning when Desmond Holt asked to speak. He had been among the quieter presences in the cabin since his arrival on the 4th day, found barely conscious in the back room of his general store, surrounded by inventory that could not keep him warm and goods that had no utility whatsoever against 15 feet of snow. He had recovered physically more quickly than some of the others, being younger and having had marginally more fuel than a few of the households Mara had reached. But there had been something working in him since he arrived, something visible in the set of his face and the way he positioned himself slightly apart from the group conversations that suggested a man engaged in a private reckoning. He stood up. He did not ask to speak to Mara alone. He did not lower his voice or pull her aside. He stood in the middle of the room with 22 other people present, and he spoke to all of them. "I need to say something," he said, "to all of you, not just to her." The room became still. "I knew," Holt said, "what this land was. I knew it was the highest ground in the valley. I understood before any of you did what a serious storm would mean for the lower properties. I have known it for years." He paused. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that cost something to maintain. "When she refused to sell, I offered her marriage. Not because I had any feeling for her, because the law would have given me the land that way, and I would have built something up here for myself, a shelter for myself." Nobody spoke. I knew what a real storm could do to the rest of you, Holt continued. I knew it, and I said nothing. I laughed at her with the rest of you because it was easier than admitting that she was building the only thing that mattered. He stopped. I wanted the advantage for myself. I was prepared to let all of you face it alone. The room remained silent for a long moment. Hargrove turned to look at Holt with an expression that was very controlled, very deliberate, the expression of a man who is deciding carefully what he is going to do with something. You knew, Hargrove said. It was not a question. I knew, Holt said. Another silence. Then Mara spoke. She had been standing near the south window, and she turned now to face the room. Not just Holt, but all of them, the 23 people who were alive in this space because of a design her father had spent his life trying to give away, and that she had carried across an ocean to build in a valley that had laughed at her for doing it. The land was never for sale, she said. It still isn't. She looked at Holt for a moment, not with anger, not with the satisfaction of someone whose judgment has been vindicated, but with the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to prove. The knowledge was always free. It still is. That is the difference between what I came here to do and what you came here to do. She paused. Anyone who wants to learn how to build this, how to build what my father designed, what this valley needs more of, I will teach them. Without charge, without condition. That offer stands for everyone in this room, including you. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down, and Hargrove, who had been watching all of this, stood up. Cornelius Hargrove was not a man who apologized easily. He was 61 years old, and he had built a ranch from bare ground through 30 years of difficulty, and he had developed over those 30 years the particular hardness that long effort in hard country tends to produce, not cruelty, but a compression, a reduction of the unnecessary, a preference for action over acknowledgement. He had been wrong about things before. He had not always said so. He stood in the middle of the second floor of the double cabin, and he looked at Mara Voss, and he said what needed to be said. I called you a fool, he said. I said a woman had no business building anything taller than a fence. I made a public joke of what you were doing, and I made sure everyone in the valley heard it. I was the first one to laugh, and probably the loudest. He stopped. My wife and my children are alive because you dug through 15 feet of snow with your own hands and got them out and brought them here. My youngest daughter is speaking again because of your dog. I owe you a debt that I do not have words large enough for. He extended his hand. I would like, he said, to be the first to learn. Mara looked at his hand, then she took it.